Yes. Take a deep breath, my friend, because today I'm going to take you into the depths of a blood-soaked era that's on the brink of being forgotten in the flow of time. The American Civil War. The dust of those years still lingers over this land, and the echoes of that great conflict are still somehow heard. But today I'll be sharing not just the war itself, but the years, the storms within people, their hopes, and their disappointments. Yes, the reasons for the war weren't just about the borders between the North and South or the issue of slavery. The events were much more complex, much deeper. The Civil War was a story of a nation confronting itself. We'll start unraveling that moment when everything began, like a knot being untied. I have a lot to tell, but let's go back to the very beginning. Are you ready to explore how that initial spark turned into a blazing fire? Close your eyes and imagine. America in the mid-1800s. The North with its industrial cities spewing smoke into the sky, and the South with its endless cotton fields stretching into the horizon. On one side, developing factories and people who believe in freedom. On the other, vast plantations, slaves, and a great fear of change. The North and South had turned their backs on each other, heading towards two different worlds. At that time, America's heart was nearly split in two. Everyone knew something was going to blow up, but no one could predict when it would happen. And so, my dear listener, our story begins right at this breaking point. It was a battle not just for the land, but for the people as well. We'll unlock the doors of the past to understand what people were thinking back then, what fears guided them. We'll unravel the complex knots that led to the start of the war. Was it a struggle for freedom, an opposition to slavery, or just economic interests? Without understanding the true face behind the war, we won't fully grasp it. So let's walk step by step towards the heart of the American Civil War. Here we are at the vast chasm that created the backdrop of the American Civil War. The economic and social differences between the North and the South had grown so deep that it seemed impossible for them to stay together. As you know, the North had become industrialized, leading in trade and industry. With smoke rising from the factories and workers sweating over machines, immigrants flocked to the region in search of new opportunities. This rapid growth shaped the North's commercial structure and its perspective on labor. Freedom, industry, progress, these were the North's new values. But the South. Oh, the South. The South was a whole different world. There, the vast cotton fields stretched endlessly. An economy built on the labor of slaves enveloped the entire society. Wealthy plantation owners amassed great fortunes through slave labor and controlled global cotton trade. In the South, slavery wasn't just an economic structure, it was also the cornerstone of a social order. While the system of slavery supported the existing prosperity, fears about the collapse of this system grew. Without slavery, the South couldn't maintain its way of life. These differences were tearing the two regions apart. The North's industry-based economy and belief in freedom and equality sharply contrasted with the South's agricultural economy reliant on slavery. But this wasn't just an economic issue. There was also a major conflict over the federal government's authority over the states. Southern states believed they had the right to determine their own fate. State rights, or the ability of local governments to create their own laws independently of the federal government, were a vital issue for the South. This was directly tied to the future of slavery. If the federal government decided to abolish slavery, the South's economic and social structure would collapse. So the South was on constant alert to defend state rights. For them, it wasn't just a debate over governance, it was a struggle for their very existence. And then there were the abolitionists. Oh, what a passionate movement this was. In the North, a fierce fight for the abolition of slavery had begun. Abolitionists shouted that slavery was inhumane and fought for the freedom of slaves. Speeches were made in newspapers, public squares, and churches, calling people to act against this oppression. Concepts of freedom, equality, and justice were at the core of this movement. But the South saw these calls as a major threat. Slavery was the backbone of their way of life and economy. As the abolitionists grew stronger and more influential, the South responded with increasing resistance. The tension between these two poles was rising, and everyone felt that an explosion was inevitable. And finally, the 1860 presidential election came. Abraham Lincoln emerged as the candidate for the Republican Party. Lincoln was firmly against the expansion of slavery into new territories. For the South, this was the beginning of a full-blown nightmare. Lincoln's election meant the end of slavery. The moment the South feared had arrived. When Lincoln won the 1860 election, the most powerful Southern states sequentially decided to secede from the Union. For them, there was no turning back. Lincoln's victory was not just a presidential election, it was the closing of an era and the birth of a new conflict. Dear friend, this is how this great divide began. The North and the South had become two separate worlds. The economic, social, and ideological differences had grown so large that it was clear these differences could not be resolved without war. From this point on, America's fate would be shaped under the shadow of weapons. Nothing would ever be the same again. Ah, yes, my dear friends, here we are at one of the greatest turning points in history, the secession of the South and the formation of the Confederacy. Just imagine the moment when a country starts to fall apart. You might wonder how things got to this point. Let me explain. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln's election as president caused a huge panic in the South. For the Southern states, Lincoln's presidency meant the end of slavery and a threat to their way of life. The South's economy was built on slavery. Plantation owners relied on slave labor to maintain their wealth, and this system was the foundation of their economic power. But Lincoln and the Republicans were opposed to the further expansion of slavery. That's why the Southern states made a decision to secede. First, South Carolina decided to leave the Union. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina declared its secession. Following this, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas also seceded, believing they would shape their own destiny. These states formed a confederacy and declared their independence. Jefferson Davis was elected as the first president of the Confederacy. Now America was divided. On one side, the United States, and on the other, the Confederacy, which had declared its independence and was trying to determine its own fate. But this separation wasn't going to be accepted easily. Lincoln was determined to do whatever it took to preserve the Union. Of course, the South's secession wasn't just a political move. It was driven by deep ideological, social, and economic conflicts. The South was firmly attached to the system of slavery and the right of states to make their own decisions. They believed that the federal government's power couldn't infringe on states' rights. Staying in the Union would mean giving up those rights. Thus, secession was seen as a struggle for freedom. Independence was seen as the only way to protect their way of life and economic system. The North, on the other hand, saw this secession as treason. The Union should not be divided, it had to remain a single nation. And so this tension was turning into an inevitable conflict. In April 1861, an event that would change the course of history occurred: the siege of Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a Union fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The Confederacy demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter. However, the Union refused. Jefferson Davis ordered an attack on Fort Sumter to demonstrate the South's resolve. On the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on the fort. This was the first shot of the American Civil War. After days of bombardment, Fort Sumter had to surrender. The Union troops evacuated the fort, but with this event, the war officially began. The siege of Fort Sumter wasn't just a military event. It became a symbol of the division between two different worldviews in America. This event, seen as the Confederacy's first victory over the Union, sparked great anger in the North. Abraham Lincoln declared this attack as an insurrection and called for 75,000 volunteer soldiers from the North. From this point on, neither the South nor the North could turn back. The Civil War had erupted with full force. The war was now unavoidable. The guns had started speaking. The conflict that began with Fort Sumter would turn into a bloody civil war lasting 4 years, shaking the heart of America. And this war would shape not just the land but the future of a nation.
Ah, my friends. In those hot summer days of 1861, excitement about the war was growing. Everyone, both in the North and the South, thought this conflict would be over quickly. Many believed that after a few battles one side would win and everyone would go back home. But history was about to tell a different story. And the first bloody chapter of that story was going to unfold at Manassas, or as it's more commonly known, Bull Run. It was a July morning. Before the sun had even risen, the Union Army set out from Washington. But let me tell you something incredible. I can't skip talking about the civilian crowds who came to watch the battle. Yes, you heard that right. Back then, people thought the war would be like a quick show. Women, children, and even politicians hopped onto carriages, bringing picnic blankets with them, and headed towards the battlefield. They had a kind of excitement and curiosity in their eyes. They thought they'd watch the fight and be back home by evening. They hadn't yet grasped the brutality of war. Union Commander General Irvin McDowell was advancing with a 35,000-strong army. His goal was to defeat the Confederate Army and march directly to Richmond to end the war. However, these newly assembled troops were not very experienced in warfare. At that time, the army relied more on courage and confidence than on discipline and tactical knowledge. Opposing him were Confederate commanders General P.G.T. Beauregard and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Jackson would later earn the nickname Stonewall, which he proved at Manassas. The battle began near a village in Manassas. In the early hours, the Union Army appeared to have the upper hand. The Southern troops were starting to retreat. The Northerners felt victory was within reach. But, my friends, things didn't go as they seemed. Stonewall Jackson had positioned his men in such a strategic way that the Union forces faced a real wall. Despite the advancing enemy soldiers, Jackson's men did not waver for a moment. And at that moment, General Bernard Bee's famous words were etched into history. Look, Jackson is standing there like a stone wall. Just as Union soldiers thought victory was so close, they suddenly began to retreat. This moment was pure chaos. The Union Army began to crumble, and soldiers were fleeing. Even the civilians who had come to watch the excitement found themselves in the middle of the battle. These people, trying to return to their carriages, retreated with the fleeing soldiers back towards Washington. They learned the hard way that war was not a game. The Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, was a huge wake-up call for both the North and the South. The South gained morale with this victory, but it became clear that the war wouldn't end quickly, even for them. The North faced serious disappointment. Those who thought the war would be over in a few months realized they had to prepare for a much longer and bloodier struggle. The Union began to understand that winning the war required more than just courage. It needed strategy, discipline, and a solid plan. This first major clash marked the beginning of how brutal and prolonged the American Civil War would be. The bloody struggle at Manassas served as a harsh reminder of the reality for both the North and the South. The war would drain the spirit of a nation, darken thousands of lives, and last much longer than either side had anticipated. Ah, friends, let me tell you about one of the bloodiest and most shocking moments of the American Civil War, the Battle of Shiloh. Now, close your eyes and transport yourself back to that time. It's April 1862. The early days of spring on Tennessee's green, lush lands, but beneath that greenery lies the ominous scent of a brutal battle about to unfold. Both the Union and Confederate armies had already learned how serious this war was. Both sides had given up on the hope that the war would be a quick affair. But friends, to truly grasp the dark and fear-filled atmosphere of those days, you need to understand just how great a tragedy this battle was. Shiloh. This name will always be remembered with blood and tears. The place where the battle erupted, Shiloh Church, transformed from a peaceful place of worship into a battlefield overrun with death in just a few days. General Ulysses S. Grant had stationed the Union Army on the banks of the Tennessee River. Grant's goal was to squeeze the Confederate forces in that area and take control of the Mississippi Valley. But the enemy wasn't sitting idle. The Confederate Army, led by General Albert Sidney Johnston, planned a surprise attack to catch Grant's troops off guard. That early morning, at an unexpected moment, the Confederate Army launched a full-scale assault on the Union forces. As the sky was still dark, artillery fire began to erupt. The enemies had caught Grant's army unprepared. Many soldiers were attacked before they even had a chance to get out of their sleeping bags. There was widespread panic at the camp by the river. Those first hours felt like a dance of death. At that moment, Grant's army had no choice but to fall back, unsure of what to do. But that was just the beginning of the battle. After that bloody first day, the Union troops began to regroup. Grant rallied his men, reorganized them, and launched a counterattack to turn the tide of the battle. The Union soldiers, reinforced by troops from the other side of the river, grew stronger. The victory the Confederates had anticipated was slipping away from them. And right in the middle of the battle, General Johnston was struck down and killed on the battlefield. His death marked a turning point for the Confederate Army. The soldiers, losing their leader, were thrown into chaos. The second day, friends, was the moment when the battle's fate was truly decided. The Union Army had fully organized and used all its strength to push back the Confederate soldiers. By the end of that day, thousands of soldiers lay dead on the battlefield. Grant's army had won, but the victory came at a heavy cost. The Battle of Shiloh showcased an unprecedented level of brutality in the American Civil War up to that point. In just 2 days, around 23,000 soldiers had been killed or wounded. It was one of the bloodiest battles both sides had faced. People came to realize after this battle just how long and ruthless the Civil War would be. Shiloh was a sign that the war was just beginning and that many more tragedies were yet to come. But friends, Shiloh wasn't just about blood and tears, it was also a symbol of courage and resilience. Grant's leadership saved the Union Army from collapse and changed the course of the war. From then on, both North and South understood that this war would leave lasting scars on both sides forever. My friends, let me take you to one of the most unforgettable and tragic moments of the American Civil War, the Battle of Antietam. Picture this, it's September 1862, and you're in the green, quiet lands of Maryland. But that silence was about to be shattered by one of the bloodiest days in history. Antietam was a turning point. There had been numerous clashes between the North and the South since the beginning of the war, but this battle would have a different impact. General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army aimed to advance into the North and gain a strategic advantage. If successful, it could lead to major diplomatic recognition for the South from powerful nations like Britain and France, potentially altering the course of the war. However, opposing them was General George McClellan, commander of the Union Army. McClellan had learned of Lee's plans ahead of time by a twist of fate. The Confederate strategic plans had inadvertently fallen into Union hands. McClellan seized this opportunity to prepare for Lee's army at Antietam Creek. On the morning when the battle was about to begin, the calm of nature was still in that pre-storm quiet, but within that silence, a disaster was brewing. The battle began at dawn. On the morning of September 17th, 1862, as the first gunshots were heard, both sides entered the fray with great determination. Antietam would become one of the greatest devastations in human history in just one day. As the hours passed, the intensity of the battle increased, with the fronts shifting back and forth. Blood was spilled on every hill and in every valley. The initial clashes took place to the north of Antietam, in the cornfield known as the cornfield. Imagine that field in your mind, bathed in golden light from the morning sun, with swaying corn stalks. But with the start of the battle, this quiet field quickly turned into a place where death danced. The corn was soaked with blood, the bodies of soldiers were entangled, and the air was filled with gunpowder smoke and screams. Union and Confederate soldiers fought fiercely in that small area. Both sides suffered incredible losses, but had no intention of retreating. Then the battle shifted to the area known as Bloody Lane. This road, this narrow dirt path had turned into a death trap. Confederate soldiers held their ground in this position while Union troops attacked with all their might to drive them out. The battle lasted for more than an hour, and both sides suffered so many casualties that the road was filled with dead bodies. From that day forward, this place was known as Bloody Lane. And of course, one of the most horrific moments of the battle occurred at Burnside Bridge. General Ambrose Burnside attempted to push Confederate forces off the bridge. The bridge was a strategic crossing point, but Confederate forces rained down fire on the Union troops from a high vantage point. Burnside's men made repeated attempts to cross the bridge, but suffered heavy losses each time. For hours, this narrow bridge became a test of death. Eventually, Union troops managed to cross the bridge, but the losses suffered there remained unforgettable. The Battle of Antietam did not result in a decisive victory. Neither the North nor the South achieved a clear win in this battle. However, what mattered was that this bloody clash halted Lee's advance into the North. General Lee's army retreated, which was a strategic victory for the Union. But, my friends, the cost of this victory was steep. That day, over 22,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. It was the bloodiest day in American history. Both sides knew that this battle was a turning point. And there's one more thing: the reverberations of this battle were significant. President Abraham Lincoln saw the victory at Antietam as an opportunity and shortly after issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring the end of slavery. This war had now become more than a conflict between North and South. It had also become a symbol of the fight for human rights and freedom. Friends, the Battle of Antietam will be remembered not only as a strategic clash, but as one of the deepest wounds in the history of humanity. On that day, Maryland's land was soaked with human blood, heroism, and tragedy intertwined.
Ah, friends, let me take you to one of the most fascinating and striking moments of the American Civil War, the Battle of Hampton Roads. But this wasn't just any naval battle. No. This was a moment when technology changed the game, rewriting the rules of naval warfare that had been in place for centuries. Until then, humanity had fought with wooden ships. But that day, it was introduced to an ironclad revolution, ironclad warships. The year was 1862. The North and South were fiercely battling for supremacy at sea, just as they were on land. But this was a bit different. The South, or the Confederacy, didn't have a strong navy. The North, being more industrially and economically advanced, had a significant advantage at sea. However, the South wasn't ready to accept this. They were looking for a solution, developing a strategy against the North's wooden ships, and this solution would go down in history as the ironclads. And so Hampton Roads was about to witness one of the most iconic naval battles in history. The South transformed an old wooden ship, the USS Merrimack, into something new. It was relaunched as the CSS Virginia, covered entirely in iron plates, making it almost invulnerable. Imagine an ironclad, friends. No one had seen anything like it before. Traditional cannons bounced off this iron monster. In March 1862, off the coast of Hampton Roads, this newly minted giant set sail against the Union Navy ships. Oh friends, imagine that moment. The Union's wooden ships, the USS Cumberland and the USS Congress, were helpless against the Virginia. In the first attack, the Cumberland was sunk, followed by the Congress. The Virginia, with its massive iron hull, almost effortlessly defeated the two ships. The wooden vessels were like toys against the ironclad, sinking helplessly into the depths of the sea. But the battle wasn't over yet. The North had a response: the USS Monitor. Yes, friends, the Monitor was a low-profile ship with a cylindrical turret, considered the ancestor of modern warships. It had almost nothing on top, just a turret that looked like a cylinder and a flat deck. But this small, low-profile ship was also made of iron. On the second day of the battle, these two giants faced off in the middle of the sea. It was like a mythological duel. Imagine, friends, two iron giants clashing amid giant waves. Cannonballs flew through the air, but both ships were almost untouched due to their armor. The Virginia and the Monitor fought for hours. Both sides attacked with all their might, trying to destroy each other. For the first time, people were fighting with ironclads, not wooden ships. The ineffectiveness of the cannons and the difficulty of strategic maneuvers showed just how tough this new kind of warfare was. The battle ended without a clear winner. But friends, it was a turning point. Navies around the world watched and realized that the era of wooden ships was coming to an end. From that day on, every major power began building its own ironclad warships. The Battle of Hampton Roads marked the beginning of a new era in naval warfare. The rulers of the seas would now be ironclads. The echoes of this clash were significant. The South had achieved a balance with the Virginia, but the North's industrial power and constant innovation eventually turned the tide of the war at sea in their favor. That moment at Hampton Roads brought a new breath to naval combat. It was a conflict that determined the future of naval warfare, not just in America but around the world. My friends, let me take you to one of the most pivotal moments of the American Civil War, a decision that changed not only the course of the war, but the very soul of a nation and the course of human history. This decision was made by Abraham Lincoln in 1863. Today, I'm going to tell you about how this decision, the Emancipation Proclamation, changed things and what it led to. At the beginning of the 1860s, America was literally on fire. There was a huge conflict between the northern and southern states. One of the major reasons for this war was the South's firm commitment to slavery. Yes, slavery. The use of people as slaves was the backbone of the Southern economy. Agriculture, especially cotton production, was built on slave labor. The North, on the other hand, was more industrialized and had a moral and human rights-based stance against slavery. This tension eventually led to the outbreak of a bloody war. In the early years of the war, Lincoln didn't directly address this huge issue because he had to be strategic. Some northern border states were also pro-slavery, and keeping these states in the Union was crucial for winning the war. But as time went on, Lincoln realized that the war was not just about preserving the Union, but also about fighting a moral battle. So he made a radical decision. On January 1st, 1863, this monumental step was taken, the Emancipation Proclamation. Oh, my friends, Lincoln's proclamation wasn't just a simple decision. It was the first major step towards abolishing slavery. With this move, all slaves in the South were officially declared free. Of course, this didn't happen immediately in practice because the South was still at war. But this proclamation changed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union, but also about defending human dignity and freedom. Northern soldiers were now fighting not just to keep a nation together, but to free people from their chains. This decision had a huge impact on society. In the South, slave owners were shocked. In the midst of the war, they suddenly faced the collapse of the system that was the foundation of their economic order. Slaves, on the other hand, welcomed the proclamation with hope. Even though they weren't free yet, a light of freedom was shining on the horizon. The proclamation also triggered waves of rebellion and escape among slaves. Now slaves were not only looking for ways to escape, but also to join the Union Army. Yes, my friends, the Emancipation Proclamation was not just a document, it was the beginning of the road to freedom. On the battlefield, this decision had significant effects as well. The North gained momentum and motivation. They were now fighting not just for a nation, but for human dignity. This strengthened the resolve of the soldiers. Additionally, about 180,000 African American soldiers joined the Union Army and made direct contributions to the war effort. They were fighting not just for freedom, but also for their own futures. This massive wave had the power to change the course of the war. However, the South responded to this decision with great anger. For them, it was not just an invasion, but a fight for existence. Slavery was not only the foundation of their economic system, but also shaped their cultural and social structures. Lincoln's decision was seen as a betrayal in the South. Instead of breaking their resolve, it made them even more determined to continue the fight. But despite the South's resistance, the morale boost from the Emancipation Proclamation and the participation of African American soldiers ultimately made the Union victory inevitable. And remember, my friends, this decision didn't just change American history, it changed world history. The abolition of slavery had a huge impact across the globe. Lincoln's strategic move was not only about winning the war, but also about making a stand for humanity. This decision, which defined a nation's moral stance, was one of the greatest steps taken for freedom and equality. The echoes of this decision are still felt today. Lincoln took this step not just to win the war, but to defend human dignity. His name is associated with freedom and justice, and this step still resonates in the hearts of the American people. And my friends, it's leaders like Lincoln who make strategic and moral decisions that change the course of history. Yes, my friends, this decision was a turning point not just for that era, but for all of humanity. All right, friends, let me take you to one of the most critical moments of the American Civil War, a turning point in history. You'll witness General Robert E. Lee's advance into the North and how this advance turned into a fateful moment at Gettysburg. On one side, the battlefield filled with the smell of blood and gunpowder; on the other, the days when a nation's destiny was being rewritten. I'll tell you this story in detail, almost as if I'm right there on the battlefield with you, amidst the neighing of horses and the sounds of cannons. By the early 1860s, the Civil War had engulfed the entire country, plunging it into a bloody stalemate. The Southern armies, under General Lee's command, had achieved significant victories and launched several impressive attacks south of Virginia. But friends, Lee had a grander plan. Instead of staying on the defensive, he wanted to take the fight to the north. This strategy could put pressure on the Union and perhaps even force the North to tire of the war and surrender. So with this goal in mind, Lee gathered his army and began moving north. Lee had a bold plan. The South couldn't win the war just by defending. They needed to go on the offensive and strike the enemy on their own soil. Additionally, a major victory on northern soil could lead to international recognition for the South and stir anti-war sentiments among the northern people. Lee planned to advance his army all the way to Pennsylvania. And so, in the summer of 1863, General Lee's bold march into the North began. Imagine, friends, the Southern Army, which had been winning victories on the battlefield and maintaining high morale for a long time. Lee, bringing with him this morale and experience, advanced into the North. His army had left Virginia, crossed the Potomac River, and was moving towards Pennsylvania's fertile fields. As Lee's army advanced, the northern people were filled with great anxiety. They were not used to seeing the war on their own soil in front of their homes. For Northerners, this was the first real glimpse of how devastating the war could be. But friends, no matter how well planned Lee's advance was, fate had its own plan: Gettysburg. A small, ordinary town that until then no one had even heard of, was about to become the center of a battle that would decide the fate of a nation. And so on July 1st, 1863, two massive armies faced off at Gettysburg. Oh friends, the land of Gettysburg was practically drenched in blood during those days. When the first clashes began, neither side could have anticipated how this conflict would escalate into a major battle. By the end of the first day, Southern forces had pushed back the Northern Army and taken control of the town. However, the Northern Army, under General George Meade, was determined to resist, because the outcome of this battle would not only decide a skirmish but potentially the course of the entire war. On the second day, friends, the battle intensified. Southern forces launched an assault to encircle the northern left flank. The strategic hill known as Little Round Top became one of the critical points of the battle. If the South had taken that hill, the Northern defense line would have been broken, and the outcome of the battle might have turned in Lee's favor. But friends, that day Northern forces fought with incredible bravery. The soldiers defending that hill resisted with all their might. Unable to capture Little Round Top, the South lost a significant strategic advantage by the end of the day. However, the most critical moment of the battle came on July 3, 1863. That day would go down in history as Pickett's charge. General Lee made a bold decision. Up until that point, Southern forces had been forcing the enemy into defensive positions, but under Lee's command, they launched a massive attack against the center of the Northern line. Thousands of Southern soldiers advanced across open terrain towards the Northern defenses. Oh friends, imagine that scene. Thousands of soldiers charging like a wave towards the enemy. But this attack turned out to be one of the bloodiest and most tragic moments of the war. The Northern forces met this advancing army with cannon and rifle fire. At that moment, the horror and brutality of the war were fully exposed. Pickett's charge, unfortunately, failed. The Southern army suffered heavy losses, and Lee had to withdraw his troops. By the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, friends, the South's last major assault on Northern territory had ended in failure. Lee's bold plan became a major turning point that changed the course of the war. The South would never be able to launch such a massive attack again, and the focus of the war would shift to Southern defense. The significance of the Battle of Gettysburg was not limited to its military results. This battle became a symbol of the struggle for the unity of the United States. After this battle, the Northern people were even more united, and their belief in the necessity of winning the war was strengthened. And General Lee's courageous decision to advance into the North became a historic turning point. Oh friends, the echoes of battle cries across Gettysburg's fields shaped the destiny of a nation. And so the three-day conflict on the bloody fields of Gettysburg came to an end. This battle went down in history as the largest and bloodiest clash of the American Civil War. The land was soaked with blood, and although this conflict did not end the war, it became a pivotal moment. All right, friends, now I'm going to take you to another significant and dramatic chapter of the American Civil War, the fall of Atlanta and the destruction of the South. I'll share this period, one of the war's most intense and devastating, as if we're on a journey through history together. We'll dive deep, experience the events in full detail, and see how the war changed people's lives and shaped a nation's destiny. By 1864, the harsh years of the Civil War had reached their peak. The relentless struggle between the North and the South was crucial both militarily and in terms of national unity. At this pivotal point in the war, a critical turning point emerged: the fall of Atlanta. Atlanta was a major industrial hub in Georgia. With its railroads, munitions factories, and production facilities, it was the backbone of the South's war effort. Because of this, the city held significant military and economic importance. General William Tecumseh Sherman, commander of the Union forces, aimed to capture Atlanta and break the South's war capacity. Sherman's campaign, known as Sherman's March to the Sea, is remembered as one of the war's most effective and devastating strategies. Sherman launched a massive military operation to besiege Atlanta. But this siege was more than just a military maneuver. Sherman and his army intended not only to breach the enemy's city defenses, but also to destroy the city's infrastructure and demoralize the South. It was both a military and psychological strategy. Sherman surrounded Atlanta, confronting the city and its surroundings with the grim realities of war. By September 1864, the conflict in Atlanta reached its peak. As Sherman's army approached, life in the city came to a halt. Exhausted and worn-out Southern defenders, along with much of the city's population caught in the middle of the fighting, faced a chaotic and tense situation. Amidst this turmoil, Sherman's forces began to break through Atlanta's defenses one by one. Finally, on September 2, 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta. Beyond simply taking the city, Sherman's goal was to destroy all military and economic resources within this strategic location. It became a brutal strategy to break the South's war capacity, not just a military victory. Sherman and his troops targeted all military and industrial infrastructure in Atlanta, severely damaging factories, railroads, and depots. By causing such extensive destruction, Sherman delivered not only a military victory but also a psychological blow. The South's war efforts suffered a serious setback with the fall of Atlanta. Sherman's capture of Atlanta profoundly altered the South's war strategies and the overall course of the conflict. The South's ability to continue fighting was significantly diminished. However, this destruction was not just a military victory, it also had deep impacts on human lives and social structures. The fall of Atlanta shattered Southern morale and intensified the suffering brought by the war. Yet, friends, the fall of Atlanta did not bring an end to the war. The war's brutal and destructive nature continued to permeate every corner of America. After Atlanta, Sherman continued his campaign known as the March to the Sea, advancing all the way to Savannah. This campaign further deepened the South's devastation. Sherman advanced by destroying roads and villages, making this journey a crucial step towards ultimately turning the war in the North's favor. Thus, the fall of Atlanta marked a fundamental shift in the course of the war. The South's significant economic and military losses brought the conflict one step closer to ending. But this destruction had deep effects not only militarily but also on a human level. As the war neared its end, we better understand how these bloody struggles on American soil shaped the country's future. Friends, the destruction of Atlanta once again revealed the harsh realities of the war and the scale of the struggle for national unity. Hey, dear listeners, now I'm going to take you deep into history, to one of the most impactful and dramatic campaigns of the American Civil War, General William Tecumseh Sherman's famous March to the Sea. Pay close attention, because this story will reveal how the war echoed not just on the battlefields but also in the hearts and minds of the people. So let's travel back to 1864 and dive into Sherman's bold and controversial march. It's 1864, and the effects of the Civil War have engulfed the entire country. The relentless conflict between the North and South is nearing its final and decisive phase. During this crucial time, General Sherman developed a daring strategy to finish the war and break the South's resistance, the March to the Sea. Sherman's march began after the capture of Atlanta and became one of the greatest examples of military strategy and psychological warfare. This wasn't just a military operation but also a moral and psychological battle. Sherman aimed to march through Georgia, destroying cities and towns along the way, and breaking the South's war capacity. Let's dive into the details of this massive operation. On November 15, 1864, Sherman and his army set out from Atlanta. This move is considered a turning point in the war, as Sherman took a bold step into the heart of the South to secure a northern victory. Sherman's plan was actually quite simple but also terrifying. The goal was to advance to Savannah and turn everything upside down along the way, destroying railroads, villages, cities, and even farms. The underlying strategic idea was to completely eradicate the South's ability to fight. Sherman wanted to change the course of the war by targeting not only enemy soldiers, but also their economic infrastructure. Sherman and his army demolished everything in their path. The march turned into a horrifying journey of destruction and devastation that lasted about 300 miles with 60,000 soldiers involved. Cities, villages, and agricultural lands were completely wrecked. Throughout this journey, Sherman's army highlighted not just military targets but also morale targets. A major psychological war was waged to break the South's resistance. In doing so, Sherman's army also destroyed Georgia's natural beauty and agricultural lands. Farms were burned, railroads were obliterated, and bridges and warehouses were demolished. Many Southerners had to witness the brutal extent of this destruction, which exposed the harsh realities of war once again. But this march wasn't just about physical destruction. Sherman aimed to crush morale and make the horrors of war felt directly. People were deprived of their homes, farms, and all their security. This had a huge impact both militarily and psychologically. Finally, Sherman and his army reached Savannah on December 21, 1864. They took the city, and this strategic victory marked another step closer to ending the war. When they arrived in Savannah, Sherman saw this success as a major victory to be celebrated across America. This victory also symbolized how much the North had broken the South's resistance and how the war had reached a turning point. The march to the sea was a significant step toward the North's strategic and psychological victory as the war approached its end. It not only shook the South's war capacity and morale, but also reminded the entire nation of the war's terrifying face. Sherman's march became a crucial factor in bringing the Civil War to an end, and the cruelty and destruction during this period once again highlighted the war's devastating impact on human life. So, dear friends, this march left an unforgettable mark in the depths of history. Sherman's march to the sea demonstrated how the war was not only militarily effective, but also how powerful it could be morally and psychologically. I hope experiencing this important historical event together helps you better understand the power of war and resilience. My dear listeners, now let's dive into one of the final chapters of the American Civil War, a time when the conflict was nearing its end and history was reaching a major turning point. I'll be taking you through the last major battles between General Ulysses S. Grant and General Robert E. Lee, the weakening of the Confederacy, and the internal conflicts that followed. Ready to feel the last breaths of the war together? By late 1864, the brutal and exhausting years of the war were coming to a head. The decisive moment for the continent of America was fast approaching. The fate of the war would be determined in this critical period, with the final major clashes between Grant and Lee leaving their mark on history. Once rivals, these two great commanders were now on the brink of their final confrontation. General Ulysses S. Grant, as the Union's military leader, had crafted a grand strategy to break the Confederacy's resistance. Under Grant's command, the Union armies launched a major offensive toward the heart of the Confederacy in Virginia. On the other side, General Robert E. Lee, the legendary commander of the South, was tasked with defending the last stand of the Confederacy. Lee's army was increasingly in dire straits, with dwindling resources and sagging morale. Lee needed to come up with a strategy to counter Grant's plans and revive the Confederacy's last hopes. The final major battles between these two leaders are commonly known as the Siege of Petersburg and the Appomattox Surrender. Petersburg, located in southern Virginia, was a crucial railroad hub and a strategic point for both Grant and Lee. Grant's forces besieged Petersburg, tightening the noose around Lee's Confederate troops. The siege dragged on for months, during which Lee's army gradually dwindled, resources became scarcer, and morale deteriorated. As the siege neared its end, Lee's situation became critical. Grant had completely surrounded Petersburg, cutting off Lee's escape routes. Lee made a desperate last stand but faced Grant's immense military power and endless resources. In the final stages of the war, Lee's forces were increasingly weakened, and eventually General Lee met with Grant to discuss surrender terms. This final meeting between Lee and Grant took place on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse. This historic encounter marked the end of the American Civil War. Lee accepted the surrender terms, officially ending the Confederacy. Grant's display of generosity and respect towards Lee helped foster a kind of peace and reconciliation between the two sides. However, the end of the war did not resolve the difficulties in the South. The weakening of the Confederacy led to internal conflicts and chaos. The war's devastating effects deeply shook the South's economy, infrastructure, and social fabric. The collapse of the Confederate government increased disagreements and struggles among Southern states. At the same time, the traumas and losses of the war had a profound impact on Southern society. These internal conflicts became a major obstacle during the South's Reconstruction process. Disputes between states and the social and economic imbalances created by the war led to a long and challenging period of rebuilding. The Reconstruction era in the South was filled with significant military, social, and political challenges. So, dear listeners, the final clashes of the American Civil War and the weakening of the Confederacy have left a lasting mark on history. Grant and Lee's last battles symbolize the end of this great war and America's path towards a new beginning. Reflecting on these important moments helps us better understand the power of war and peace. As we reach the end, we've highlighted the deep impact of the war on human lives, the importance of strategies and leadership, and the immense transformation that followed. Remembering these crucial moments in history sheds light on our understanding of the past and guides us in drawing lessons for the future. Dear listeners, today I'm taking you to a pivotal moment in the American Civil War, focusing on the siege of Petersburg and the fall of Richmond. This period saw great hopes for the South and resolute actions from the North, which were etched into the pages of history. If you're ready, let's dive into the details, depth, and historical significance of these two events. It's the summer of 1864, and in the heart of the South, in Petersburg, Virginia, the fate of the American Civil War was about to be decided. Petersburg was crucial both strategically and logistically, with its railroads and supply routes playing a vital role for the Confederacy. General Ulysses S. Grant aimed to capture Petersburg to gain control over this important supply center. The siege of Petersburg began in June 1864 and lasted a grueling 9 months. Grant's forces surrounded the city, cutting off all roads, railways, and supply lines, making it increasingly difficult for Lee's army to get food and supplies. This strategic move had a profound impact on the morale of the Confederacy. Grant's troops dug trenches around Petersburg, effectively surrounding the area. The brutal siege of Petersburg created immense difficulties for both sides. Lee's army faced severe pressure due to shortages of food and supplies. The North's enormous military strength and ever-increasing resources were on the verge of breaking the South's resolve. The siege turned into bloody conflicts, with heavy losses on both sides, highlighting the tragic nature of the war. By the end of the siege, General Lee's situation had become critical. Supply chains in the city were cut off, morale plummeted, and Lee's army was on the brink of collapse. Grant's complete encirclement of Petersburg and closure of Lee's escape routes were major factors in breaking Lee's final resistance. Following this turning point, on April 3, 1865, General Lee was forced to withdraw from Petersburg and retreat towards Richmond. Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was now the last major stronghold for the South's resistance. However, this retreat indicated that Richmond was in grave danger. After a tense few days, on April 3, 1865, Richmond fell to Union forces. The city collapsed quickly, and the Northern armies took control. Grant's success at Petersburg, combined with the fall of Richmond, delivered a decisive blow to the Confederacy, signaling the end of the war. The fall of Richmond was not only a military victory, but also a moral and symbolic collapse. As the center of the Confederate government, its capture by the North marked the nearing end of the war for the South. Richmond's fall was a significant indicator that the Confederacy was crumbling and that the end of the war was imminent. These events were critical moments in the final stages of the American Civil War. becoming some of the most significant military and strategic maneuvers in history. The battles at Petersburg and Richmond were major turning points that led to the war's conclusion. Understanding these pivotal events in detail helps us grasp the dynamics of war and peace more comprehensively. Together, we've explored the destructive face of war and the new beginnings that peace can bring. Dear listeners, today we're going to dive into the final moments of the American Civil War, focusing on the dramatic events at the end of the war and the significant changes experienced by the people and soldiers afterward. Let's explore these critical moments in history, from Lee's surrender to the official end of the war and the aftermath. It's early April 1865. The North's victory was becoming increasingly clear. After the fall of Petersburg and Richmond, General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederacy, deeply felt that the South no longer had the strength to continue. Lee knew it was time to end the fight. The devastating effects of the war had pushed the Confederacy into a severe crisis both morally and logistically. Lee's surrender took place on April 9, 1865, in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. This moment has been etched into history as one of its most memorable. Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee met in this village to officially declare the end of the war. Even as he accepted the terms of surrender, Lee maintained a dignified stance, showing respect to the Northern commander. The terms of Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse were quite humane and understanding. Grant promised that no retaliation would be made against Confederate soldiers, and that prisoners of war would be treated with dignity. This moment between Lee and Grant became a significant step in moving beyond the brutal nature of the war towards peace and understanding. This surrender marked the official end of the American Civil War. The conclusion of the war brought great relief and joy to the country. However, this end was not just about stopping the conflict, but also the beginning of deep social and economic changes within the nation. Following the war, the United States entered a major period of reconstruction. The end of the Civil War represented not only a military victory, but also the start of significant social and economic transformations. This period revealed the profound impact of the war on both soldiers and civilians. Firstly, with the end of the war, millions of American soldiers and civilians had to return to their lives. The South faced significant destruction in many cities and towns due to the Confederacy's defeat. People had to enter a reconstruction phase to rebuild from the devastation. This process involved not just physical infrastructure, but also societal structure. After the war, the freedom and civil rights of former slaves became major issues. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had ended slavery, but integrating freed slaves into social and economic life wasn't immediate. The end of slavery in the South marked the beginning of a struggle for many freed individuals to start new lives. In their early days of freedom, these individuals faced discrimination and poverty. The Reconstruction era was filled with various efforts to address these issues. During this time, the U.S. government implemented many reforms aimed at rebuilding the South and supporting freed slaves socially and economically. However, these reforms did not always meet expectations and continued to fuel social tensions. While the end of the war did restore national unity for the United States, the social and political conflicts of this period influenced the country's future development. The Reconstruction era is remembered as a time of both military and social transformation in American history. Dear listeners, the end of the Civil War and the subsequent period is considered one of the most important and transformative times in the country's history. This era not only reflects the deep scars left by the war, but also symbolizes the creation of a new national identity and social order. Understanding these crucial moments in history helps us learn from the past and approach the future with a clearer perspective. Experiencing the final moments of the Civil War, and its aftermath together is like taking a journey through the depths of history. Dear listeners, today we're diving into one of the most dramatic and impactful moments in our history following the American Civil War. This moment left an indelible mark on both the nation and the history books. We'll explore the national shock of Lincoln's assassination and the complexities of the Reconstruction era under Andrew Johnson. Get ready as we embark on this historical journey. In the spring of 1865, as the southern states of the United States entered the Reconstruction phase, one of the country's most important and beloved leaders met a tragic end. Abraham Lincoln, who was working to save and reunite the nation from the ravages of war, was targeted by an assassin. On the evening of April 14, 1865, a dark event unfolded at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. While watching a play, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Booth was known as an actor and was a man who saw the loss of the South in the war as a personal reckoning. Lincoln's assassination shocked the entire nation and plunged it into mourning. Booth fled the scene and was captured after a 12-day intense manhunt. Lincoln's murder was not only a national trauma, but also shook the newly formed national unity. President Lincoln had been a moral pillar for the country, especially in the efforts to end slavery and during the post-war Reconstruction process. His loss was met with profound grief in the North and created a complex mix of confusion and uncertainty in the South. With Lincoln's death, Vice President Andrew Johnson ascended to the presidency, and he was tasked with guiding the country through the Reconstruction era. Johnson had previously served as the governor of Tennessee and as Lincoln's vice president. However, Johnson's presidency faced many challenges, and the Reconstruction process became quite complicated. Andrew Johnson was known for quickly implementing his Reconstruction plans after the war. He advocated for the rapid readmission of southern states and the reintegration of former Confederate officials into the government. However, Johnson's Reconstruction policies were seen as inadequate in protecting the civil rights of freed slaves, leading to serious disagreements between the North and South. Johnson's presidency was marked by numerous challenges and tensions. He frequently clashed with Congress, which led to his impeachment trial in 1867. Although Johnson was not removed from office, his presidency is remembered as a period of increasing political and social tension. The Reconstruction process created significant change and uncertainty in the country. Efforts to guide the South's rebuilding and the attempts to reorganize Southern society post-slavery initiated a deep social and political transformation. During this time, there were major debates about the civil rights, economic conditions, and social integration of freed slaves. Dear listeners, Lincoln's assassination and Andrew Johnson's presidency represent perhaps one of the most complex and pivotal periods in American history. This era symbolizes the profound societal and political changes following the end of the war, the nation's rebuilding efforts, and the events that cemented their place in the history books. Every step and decision played a crucial role in shaping the country's future. Understanding these moments, tracing the lessons of the past, and drawing insights for the future is key to delving into our history and grasping the essence of our nation. Dear listeners, we've reached the end of a long and tumultuous journey. Throughout our deep dive into the American Civil War, we've explored not just the conflict itself, but also how it shaped the history of our nation. Now, let's review this crucial period one last time and reflect on what it has taught us. The American Civil War was more than just a military conflict. It was a process of redefining, testing, and transforming a nation. This war is defined not only by the bloody clashes between the North and South, but also by the end of slavery, the restoration of national unity, and the restructuring of American society. The assassination of Lincoln deeply shocked the nation and complicated the post-war Reconstruction process. Abraham Lincoln's death was not just the loss of a leader, but also a blow to the nation's hopes and ideals. However, his vision and struggle inspired the country's rebirth. Under Andrew Johnson's presidency, the Reconstruction process turned into a tough battle. Johnson's policies played a significant role in balancing the reintegration of the South and the protection of the rights of freed slaves. What happened during this period profoundly affected the country's social and political structure. As we've seen, the final years of the war and the aftermath encompassed major change and transformation processes that shaped America's modern history. From rebuilding cities to freed slaves stepping into new lives, everything held great importance for the country's future. The nation's process of redefining itself involved deep transformation for both individuals and communities. Every step, every decision left lasting marks in history books. And even today, understanding these marks helps us shape the future with the lessons of the past. Dear listeners, by narrating this important historical period, we've opened a window to better understand the depth of the nation's struggles, successes, and sorrows. Every war, every conflict, and every national change and transformation process is part of a larger story. These events reveal not only a period but also the resilience of the human spirit and societies. This journey reminds us that history is not just a tale of the past, but a teacher carrying important lessons for the future. Beyond wars, struggles, and changes, humanity continues to move forward, learn, and grow. Delving into history not only opens the doors to the past, but also illuminates hopes and goals for the future. As I say goodbye as your guide, I hope this journey through the depths of history has inspired you, and that you can take stronger steps into the future with the lessons of the past. Until our next historical adventure, I wish you to live with the lessons of history and the opportunities of today in mind. Farewell, dear friends. Looking forward to seeing you on our next exploration.